Today I have a project for you guys that has a lot of cool gritty synths, stuff like this. Now I would love to discuss all of the interesting sound design that goes into making all of these synths, but unfortunately a lot of them have been frozen. So as you can see, we have this sound over here, which is kind of like the main sound that is happening over here. And while I would love to just show you the serum patch that led to this and all of the processing that I did and all of that good stuff, as you can tell, I can no longer do so. Here's another one that is acting a little bit more as a backing sequence. As you can hear, also nice and gritty and like very strong sounding. I have a different sound over here, which fortunately is still in MIDI, so we can still take a look at that one. As you can hear, that also has a nice bit of grit to it. So since I cannot really go into the patches, what I would instead want to do is just kind of discuss the type of sound design that leads to these kind of sounds. And then together we'll make a few examples from scratch. So when it comes to this kind of sound design, the main thing that you'll hear is that there's probably some kind of distortion involved. Let's just look at this patch over here. If we go into the effects, for sure there's a very strong distortion over here. In this particular case, we're using the 0-square distortion. And this is the type of distortion which is mainly active at the lower parts of the waveform. So what you should probably first do is actually look at distortion and how it works. I was actually planning on doing a more in-depth video on this topic as well, just looking at all of the different ways that like distortion works and how you can actually look at a graph like we saw before here in Serum. So this graph over here, how you can interpret that. I think I've already done a video on that, but that was a long time ago and it didn't get a lot of views. And also I've since learned a lot about how this stuff actually works. So if you're interested in that, leave a comment down below and I'll get right on to making that video. But for now, I just quickly want to go over the basics, and the way that we're going to do that is with this setup over here. We have an oscillator over here, which is just outputting a basic sine wave, in this case in G#1. So that will sound something like this. As you can hear, nice and subby. And then that oscillator is followed by this wave shaper over here, which is where this graph comes in, the graph that we saw before as well. And then we have an oscilloscope that allows us to look at the resulting waveform. So for now, I'm actually going to turn this off so that we don't have to hear it. We can just see it. And then I can turn this on here and we'll see that the waveform shows up. And now we can start to edit it. So if I move this around, you can see that the waveform is changing, meaning that we can start to look at what is actually happening to the graph. One thing that I want to do though is make this full scale. So as you can see, the wet is at -11. We want to set that to 0. So that we can make use of the full wave shaper and we can also see the waveform in its fullest here. And what you'll find that the wave shaper does is it really just takes every individual sample that is coming in. Not the sample as in file sample, but the sample as in each individual sample of the signal. Here's another tangent, but for anybody that doesn't know, if you look into a waveform, as you can see over here, you get these dots. These are the individual samples of the waveform. So this is where the waveform is digitized. And of course, if it's playing through your speaker, you're going to get a continuous signal. It is continuously going to play. But in the digital domain, you cannot have an infinite resolution. So there's individual points that kind of mark out where the analog signal is going to play. So what the wave shaper allows you to do is it allows you to take those samples and remap them to different volumes. One of the things I have to do in this particular wave shaper is set the dry wet all the way to 100%. Of course, we want the full effect of our wave shaper here so that we can really study it. And let's say that for every sample at -6 dB, we want to go up to full scale to 0 dB. What we can do in the graph is make 2 points here. You can already see that I'm making some edits, even if I do it like that. I can zoom in this one a little bit if I want really detailed. So I can move here and here, and I can really just focus these points around that 6 dB area here. And then for 6 dB, we make another point, like so and like so. And we just move that up. And now you can see here, there's a few spikes appearing. If we zoom in, you should be able to see that these spikes are going to hit 0 dB over here, so full scale. Let's make this a little bit wider here, so that it's easier to see the spikes. We're going to go like that and like that. And now we get these little horn things over here. So what is happening is that the sine wave is coming in. It's starting at its lowest volume over here. And then it just goes up and up and up the graph while it is going up and up and up here. And at some point, it is going to come right here to this point over here. And this is where it starts to be remapped to a different volume. So it's going to take the volume that is inputted over here, and it's going to say, okay, where does that volume go? Oh, it goes to here. So once this waveform hits the -6 dB, which used to be right here, it is going to look at that -6 dB and it's going to say, oh, it's going to go all the way up. And as you can see over here, this part is now mapped to 0 dB. Now the fun thing is that you now understand all of these graphs. So the graph that we saw before, we can just interpret what that means. Let's go back into that synth, which is this one over here. When we look at this graph, we see a double version of that. What that means is that what we were looking at before was just kind of like this portion of the graph. The reason for that is because the sample can be both positive and negative. And we see that over here, this graph is introducing those peaks both in the positive and the negative part of the cycle. What we can do is in this particular plugin, we can set it to asymmetric mode. And then we can see that we're just going to get it to the positive parts. What that means now is that you can see 0 dB is going to be over here. In this case, it's written in percentages. I don't know why it's not in dB. But that doesn't really matter. As you can see right now, we're just affecting the positive part of the waveform. And if we move it like this, we can make the graph very similar to what we have in that serum patch by just doing something like this and like this. Let me just holding Alt, move this here, give this a little bit of a curve like that, this a little bit of a curve like that. And hopefully you can see that these two graphs look very much alike. Of course, they're not an exact match. That's not what I was going for. But you can see that this graph is doing something to the waveform, mainly boosting it around the lower areas over here. But this sound that we have over here isn't really gritty sounding. It's not going to sound aggressive. I'm going to lower it a little bit because I'm obviously distorting. But you can hear it has a little bit of a click to it, but it doesn't really have that grit to it that we, for example, hear in here. What seems to be the case is that this sound is a little bit more noisy, and the best way that I can describe it is like the high frequencies of that grittiness are spread out over the whole waveform, whereas here we get these distinct clicks in the waveform. I can demonstrate that more by taking this sound and just putting it down an octave. Maybe even lower. And now as you can hear, we get those individual clicks from the waveform, which is these clicks that we see over here. You can see if I zoom in that we have this snap going from one position to the next position, which is actually causing that clicky sound that we hear. But that means that there's no higher frequencies from this point all the way over here. And then there's a click of higher frequencies. And then there's nothing from here all the way over here. And then there's another click that we see kind of cut off over here. So what we're dealing with in this case is a waveform that has high frequencies in just parts of the sound. Whereas, as I said before, these sounds over here have high frequencies throughout the whole sound. Now, the way that we're achieving that in this particular sound over here is a multitude of different factors. For one, there's a delay in here, which is taking the waveform and duplicating it later on in the track. And as you can see, the higher frequencies are completely let through, in the sense that we're not filtering out any of the high frequencies with this filter over here. So that is one of the things that is kind of dragging out the sound and making it a little bit smoother, because we're taking high frequency spikes and potentially putting them in other places in relation to the actual oscillation over here. Because if we look at this oscillation, this is kind of like the same thing as we saw before. We have no high frequencies, a click with high frequencies, no high frequencies, no high frequencies. And that would mean that the sound in and of itself coming out of the oscillator would be clicky rather than gritty. But there's other stuff involved too. We have this oscillator B over here, which is making 8 copies of the waveform and then playing them from random starting positions. So you can imagine that we're going to generate 8 extra clicks and we're going to move them all over the place over here because they're randomly starting. So you may have a click starting here, a click starting there, one starting here. Maybe you have 2 very close to each other over here. Maybe then there's a little bit more of a gap and then there's another one over here and over there. So in this particular case, just with the oscillator B, we're going from 1 click throughout each of the cycles to 8 clicks throughout each of the cycles. And of course, there's also detuning, so those clicks are going to be moving around in the cycle. But I don't think that that is an effect that you're going to hear in this particular case because the notes are very short. And of course, you need longer notes to actually hear that kind of effect. The next thing that is contributing a lot to the grittiness is this resonance over here. As you can see, this is the kind of filter that introduces a lot of phase shift. As you can see over here, this is the phase shift graph. And what will happen is that it will take this click, and with this high resonance, it will both post-ring the higher frequencies in this click, which is where it's operating, of course, as well as shift them around due to the phase shift. Now, as I said before, that is all going into that very strong distortion, and that is going to generate extra harmonics, extra higher frequencies. So all of these lower frequencies in here are going to be generating higher frequencies later down the line in this distortion over here. So there's a lot of different things that we're doing in this particular patch to generate that grittiness. So now I want to open up a new sound so that we can look into this a little bit further, maybe start a little bit from scratch. So I'm going to open up a serum. And the fastest way to get these gritty kind of sounds is just by starting with a saw wave and taking this click and kind of smearing it out, as we said. And there's actually a very interesting process that you can use for that, and that is randomizing the phase. So if I go over here and set randomize all, you can see that we get a waveform where there's no individual click, but it's always like a sharp waveform. It's always moving around, kind of going up and down, which is the telltale sign of higher frequencies. Of course, a low frequency oscillation looks somewhat like this. If I just make a flat line over here, and then I make a sine wave, I can probably do that faster in another way, but here you have a sine wave. You can see that this is a very slow movement. And if I start adding higher frequencies to that, you can see we get faster, 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 faster movement. And if I go very high, you get to see that we get a lot of sharp edges here and a lot of sharper movement. So we can already tell that this has a lot of higher frequencies. And of course, that is the case because we can see all of those higher frequencies up in here. They are lower in volume, but they still contribute to the waveform because there's just so many of them. So this is already going to get you a grittier sound than your standard saw wave. You can hear that very clicky texture versus that very gritty texture, very washed out kind of texture. Even though if you look at it on the spectrum, it is actually going to show you the same frequency spectrum. Now, knowing what we know now, what we can do is we can incorporate some of the other things that we saw in that other sound. So for example, maybe we want to introduce a little bit of extra higher frequencies of that gritty area. We can do something like this. And then maybe we can distort that a little bit to see if we can bring out even more higher frequencies. Of course, it's always good to check a whole bunch of them. In this particular case, something like the diode would be very nice. One of the other things that we can do is use the multiband compressor, again, to bring out higher frequencies over here. And because higher frequencies is a relative thing, what we can also do is reduce the lower frequencies. So for example, we just high pass this like this. And you can hear that we get a grittier sound just because the absence of that stability of the lower frequencies. We can take that to the extreme as well by going into here in Ableton and just removing them even more. Maybe you want a little bit of that lower frequency texture still left in there to give the sound back a little bit more stability. But we also want to bring out the grittiness even more by maybe doing something like this. I like to do this just under 10K maybe. And maybe now let's try another layer of saturation. And then we get something like that. Now, a cool technique that I know of in sound design is that once you have set up a chain like this, implementing changes to that chain will start to influence how already set up effects will actually work. So for example, we have this saturator over here, which is reacting to the input signal. But what if we slightly change that input signal going into it? One of the things that I really like is doing a little bit of stereo processing before a saturator like this. So I'm going to get M stereo spread just to generate some stereo wave here. And you'll hear what kind of impact this will have on the sound. You can hear, of course, it becomes wider, but sometimes this actually changes the texture of any saturation or distortion that you have later on in the chain. The reason for that, of course, goes back to the setup that we saw before, in that a stereo generator is going to introduce differences in the left and the right channel, which it does by altering the samples. In fact, any process that you apply to a sound will alter the samples within a signal, because otherwise, if there was no changes to the samples, you wouldn't hear the effects. There would be no change, so there would be no effect. And because this effect is so based on where the position of the sample is, especially if you're doing a more heavy distortion like we're doing over here, because of that fact, with certain distortion setups, small changes to where the samples actually are can have a massive impact on where they end up. One of my favorite but very underused plugins is Isotope Trash. Let's load it up right here. Isotope Trash 2. Don't get the version 3, it's not worth it, just get the version 2. And here again you can see one of these reassignment graphs which we looked at before. And I'm just going to get some very heavy preset here, something like this maybe. And we'll take the saturator and remove that. And now we have this distortion over here. Of course, it's also doing a little bit of convolution here. But we'll keep that in because it's nice for the sound as well. But what you'll find is that now, if I turn on and off the stereo spat, you'll hear an actual difference in tonality in the sound. And of course, that has to do with the fact that this graph is so extreme. You can see the blue line is actually what is happening in the graph. So you can see it's going up and down and making massive changes. And you can imagine that shifting a sample up a little bit is going to cause it to be reassigned to a whole different volume. Now, an interesting fact that I just quickly want to mention is that when it comes to this kind of graph, it is more important than you think, because this is also the concept that makes compressors work. So if I put a compressor on here, if we go over here, we also have this kind of reassignment graph, but it's just controlled by the ratio and the attack over here. But it's just controlled by the ratio and the threshold over here, as well as the knee, which is like how smoothly it transitioned from 1:1 to the actual ratio. But if I set a threshold and a very steep ratio, what will essentially happen is that any volume below it will be remapped to its exact volume. And then once we get to the threshold, it will not exceed the threshold because, as you can see, all of these values are mapped to the same volume. This is the same graph that we saw in the distortion. The only difference between distortion and compression is that there's attack and release to it. So it takes a little bit of time for that effect to start and stop happening. Whereas wave shaping and distortion is that same effect, but instantaneously. What that means for you is that, again, if we look into an individual sample of the file, if we move into here, let's say that we have this peak over here, saturation and wave shaping and distortion, all of that is going to look at this peak and say that this is going to exceed a certain level. Say that our distortion graph also looks like this, where it doesn't affect the signal at all below a certain threshold, below a certain volume, and then above it, it just clips it at that volume and it cannot exceed that volume. A saturator might get this input signal and right here it starts hitting the ceiling and it will immediately clip off the waveform and just will make it square. Whereas a compressor, it will take maybe a millisecond for that to start activating, meaning that this whole peak will basically go through it without change. As you can see, if I move out over here and I try to select 1 millisecond in length, this is a millisecond, so you can imagine that an event like this doesn't start triggering the compressor. Alright, so back into our Gritty sound design, let's open up the serum again. As you can see, we started off with a saw wave over here, but maybe that is not the tonality that you're going for. Another thing that you can do is just start by looking at the Gritty waveform. So I'm going to open up oscillator B over here, and we're going to look into my tones pack, volume 2 in this case. And this is really where the tones pack is coming in handy, because as you can see, there's a whole bunch of different wave cycles, most of them having some kind of gritty texture to them. And you can see the properties that we saw before, where there's many changes in there. You can see a lot of high frequencies over here. And you can imagine that the sound that we're going to get out of it is also going to be very gritty. Of course, we're using a whole bunch of other processes to make it gritty here. So let's turn those off a little bit so that you can hear. Here we have more of like a clicky, bubbly sound, which means that you see that there's a lot less higher frequencies and we just get this like main sine wave oscillation over here. It's not an exact sine wave, as you can see, there's still a lot of harmonic content in here, but it's not as gritty as, say, something like this. In this case, this waveform looks a little bit strange because it's purely positive energy. This can be very useful for maybe, say, an FM setup. But when it comes to your gritty tones, you probably want something that oscillates around silence like we have over here. In this case, we get a very clicky sound because, again, we see those very strong clicks here, 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 here. And there's some high frequency energy in between, but the main energy is coming from these clicks over here. And you can immediately hear that in the change of texture in the sound. It doesn't sound as washed out, it doesn't sound as gritty in this particular case. Now, another way to do it is through FM, and I like to show my FM inside a faceband because it's very visual. Of course, when you're trying to learn this kind of stuff or when you're trying to design a specific type of sound, then having a very visual representation of the actual waveform is very useful. So what we can do is we can just set up a basic FM setup over here. Let's take a sine wave and modulate the phase over here. And you can see that we're immediately going to get a very clicky waveform. We discussed this before, how we see that, by just looking at the waveform and seeing that there's actual clicks, actual snaps up and down, and there's not a lot of high frequencies in between. So essentially, we need to introduce a little bit more mess in here. And the way that you do that with FM is just making the setup more complex. So let's do that. Let's maybe go for a square wave over here. And we're going to move this like that. We're going to move this maybe like this. I can already see that in certain areas, we're going to get some high frequency mess here. So maybe let's add another oscillator to the mix. We're going to get another sine wave over here, which is going to do this one. And we'll have it do this one as well. Maybe like so. And now if we scroll up, we can already see that we get some very high frequency stuff, which we can manipulate even more. Maybe like that. And now we should hear, even without having heard the sound, we can already make a judgment on what the sound is going to sound like. We're probably going to get a very gritty sound out of this. There we are. Now all of this is going to culminate in the last technique that I want to show you, which is responsible for some of the sounds that we heard before, mainly for this sound over here. As well as this sound over here. You can hear both very gritty sounds, but you can also hear that there's a constant change in the tonality of this sound. Now, I've shown this technique off before, but I just want to highlight it again because I think it's really, really powerful. If you go into Serum and you go to my tones pack, what you'll find as a separate download on the Gumroad page is these combination tables. So here you can see I have a folder with full tables, and you'll be able to find these 8 tables in here. And what the combination tables are is just 256 of the different wave cycles, all crammed into a single wave table. As you can see, this is not really meant to morph between, but you can see that you have a whole bunch of different gritty textures to choose from here. And the cool thing that you can do is just set this to maybe a bar here, and then holding shift, go up and down, maybe like this. It really doesn't matter because these wave cycles are just randomly put in here. But you just assign this to the wavetable position, and then you have a start of some Gritty Synths. Maybe you need to change it a little bit, maybe move some of them around. And then of course, maybe you can take some of the other effects that we looked at before, stuff like this, and put it on there. Let's turn on the stereo spread and distortion again. Maybe here in the effects, we want a little bit of extra stereo width as well. Through the dimension, we want to compress it a little bit to bring out some higher frequencies. Maybe we want to distort it a little bit as we saw that before. And then we get something like this. Maybe that is a little bit too much with the convolution over here. It's now getting very loud, of course, so we'll turn it down. What might also be nice is to add a little bit of gate to this. So something like this. We'll set it to 1/8 note and then assign it over here. Or maybe you want a gate something like this. Here's a neat little trick that you can do. Make a shape that looks somewhat like this, and now you get something that sounds like this. You get a nice like galloping sound. In this case, I would set them both to trigger so that they start together. And you can hear we get some nice gritty, noisy sounds. In this particular case, it is getting very noisy, so maybe the trash is a little bit too much. Or maybe you just want a little bit of that. So by setting the mix to maybe like 50%, you get this. And as you can hear, we get the sound that is very similar in idea to the sounds that we heard before. Now, hopefully with the concept that I've explained, you can do your own gritty sound design. What I highly recommend with these kind of sound design things, if you're looking into a specific category like we're doing today, is just taking an afternoon or maybe even a full day out of your life and just experimenting in the session, as opposed to actually writing music. When you want to experiment with this stuff, you want to have a clean plate and you don't want to be bound by any musical idea that you're into. In this particular case, of course, I'm doing a tutorial, so I wanted to have a few example sounds out of an actual project. But the best way to learn this kind of thing is to spend a day just doing sound design. Maybe just lay out like 10 minutes of kick and bass that you can play on top of. And then you can experiment with making different sequences, making different one-shots, making maybe even gritty atmospheres, that kind of stuff. Which is also something that I have an example of, by the way. That is this kind of stuff over here. I'll quickly run through it. We have a gritty starting tone, as you can see over here, again from the tone spec. It just goes through a bandpass. A little bit of tube distortion over here. This is nowhere near enough to be like actually strong distortion, as we can see from the graph, which we now understand. And then the bandpass filter is going up and down, and we have a delay to really extend the sound and make it atmospheric. And that's it. That's all there is to it. But you can see the main principle at work here in that we start off with a gritty tone, and therefore it becomes a gritty atmosphere. And as I said before, this is stuff that you can experiment with, and doing that for a day or maybe even just an afternoon or an evening is much better than watching a few extra tutorials or something like that, because it actually puts your mind at work and it allows you to actually implement the things that you maybe have learned in this particular video. So I would highly recommend that you experiment with the wave shaper, but maybe also the tone spec. Of course, the tone spec is a paid product. There is a free version available, but that includes just a few of the tones, and also it doesn't have the combination tables in there. But still, you'll find a link down below in the description if you're interested in the tone spec, and it should get you to my Gumroad where you will be able to buy it, but also get the free demo. And of course, we've talked about many more processes in this video, so experiment with all of them. And if you just do that for an afternoon, you're going to be good enough at this kind of stuff that whenever you need this kind of sound, you can just whip it up in maybe 2-3 minutes. And honestly, that is a philosophy that is going to extend to any type of sound. But in this case, I just wanted to show you it in the context of these gritty sounds over here. So that's going to be it for the video. I hope that you enjoyed. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and of course, make sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel is to continue watching some of my videos. So there will be 2 up on the screen right now for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.